By the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler believed the war in Europe was already won. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Britain was still standing, but isolated. In his mind, there was only one real enemy left: the Soviet Union. For Hitler, this war wasn't just about territory. It was about ideology. He saw the Soviet Union as a Jewish Bolshevik threat that had to be erased. He also wanted the land, the endless fields of Ukraine, the oil of the Caucasus, and the iron of the Ural Mountains. His generals warned him, invading Russia was too risky. He ignored them. On June 22, 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 2,500 aircraft crossed a front line stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was the largest invasion in human history, and it caught the Soviet Union completely off guard. Within days, German armored divisions advanced faster than anyone thought possible. Soviet cities fell one after another. Communication lines collapsed. Entire armies vanished. In the first 3 weeks alone, more than 1 million Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. By early July, German forces were moving towards Smolensk, a key gateway to Moscow. Villages burned. Civilians fled east. Soviet commanders scrambled to form any kind of defense. Near one small village west of Smolensk, a Soviet anti-tank unit took position. Among them was a 22-year-old soldier named Ivan Kolosov. He was quiet, disciplined, and had never seen real combat before. That morning, the sound of engines came from the distance. Deep, heavy, mechanical. A German tank column was approaching. 10 panzers supported by infantry. The Soviet position was weak. Their commander had already been killed in an airstrike hours earlier. The first shells landed. The ground shook. Within minutes, the Soviet line was destroyed. Men ran for cover. Kolosov stayed behind, next to the 45mm anti-tank gun. He loaded the last armor-piercing shell. The tanks were less than 400 meters away. Through the smoke, he could see the lead panzer moving straight toward him. He aimed at the lower turret ring, the thinnest part of its armor, and fired. The shell hit. A moment later, the panzer erupted in flames. The rest of the column stopped, confused, thinking they had entered a minefield. Soviet infantry opened fire, hitting the exposed crews. 2 more tanks were disabled. The German advance halted for several hours. By the time they reorganized, Soviet reinforcements had arrived and fortified the line. The counterattack forced the Germans to pull back temporarily. That single shot, fired by one man in a hopeless situation, delayed the German advance towards Smolensk by almost 24 hours. It bought enough time for thousands of Soviet troops to dig in and prepare for the next assault. No one knew his name for decades. Only years later did historians find military reports confirming the event. It didn't change the outcome of the war, but in that one moment, on that one field, one soldier had done the impossible. He stopped a Nazi tank column. By late June 1941, the German blitzkrieg had ripped through Western Russia. Towns fell one after another. Soviet defenses collapsed under the pressure of tanks, aircraft, and artillery. The Red Army was retreating in chaos, leaving behind burning equipment in abandoned positions. Among the soldiers sent to slow the advance was a 28-year-old corporal named Fyodor Oklopkov of the 1075th Rifle Regiment. His unit was part of the desperate defensive line near Smolensk, a key crossroads on the road to Moscow. The German spearhead, led by the 7th Panzer Division, was pushing toward them fast. Oklopkov wasn't a famous sniper or an officer, just a quiet hunter from Siberia. But like many men drafted into the Red Army, he knew how to shoot. His precision and patience would soon change everything. The morning of July 10, 1941, was heavy with smoke. Soviet commanders received reports that a column of German tanks was advancing along a rural road near their position. They had almost no anti-tank weapons left, just a few Molotov cocktails, one damaged anti-tank gun, and the courage of exhausted men. Oklopkov volunteered to scout ahead. Crawling through the tall grass, he found a small ridge overlooking the dirt road. Through his binoculars, he saw a terrifying sight. More than a dozen tanks moving slowly, followed by trucks filled with infantry. He had one rifle, one grenade, and a few bullets. The tanks rolled closer, the ground trembling with their weight. Oklopkov spotted the lead vehicle, a Panzer III, and something unusual. Its commander was exposed, standing half out of the turret, scanning the horizon with binoculars. Oklopkov waited. His hands didn't shake. Years of hunting deer in the Siberian forest had taught him to breathe slowly, to wait for the perfect second. When the tank reached the curve in the road, he squeezed the trigger. The German officer fell instantly. The tank stopped. For a moment, there was silence. A few seconds stretched into eternity. Then shouts erupted among the Germans. Soldiers scrambled from their trucks, shouting orders. A few fired into the trees. Others dropped to the ground. The column behind had halted, engines rumbling, unsure what had happened. Oklopkov stayed perfectly still. Through the scope, he saw the confusion spread like panic. One wrong move from any Soviet soldier could expose their position. But none moved. They knew, if the Germans believed there was a larger ambush, it would buy them time. Suddenly, a mortar shell whistled overhead and exploded near the lead tank. Soviet gunners had joined in, firing blindly toward the sound. The Germans responded with machine gun bursts, cutting through the bushes. Oklopkov hugged the ground as dirt sprayed around him. The road became a battlefield. The first tank blocked the path. Those behind tried to maneuver off the narrow dirt road and sank immediately into the soft, marshy ground. The Soviet artillery zeroed in. One shell hit a truck carrying fuel. It exploded, lighting the sky with black smoke. In less than 10 minutes, a simple rifle shot had thrown an armored column into chaos. By the time the shooting stopped, 5 tanks were disabled and dozens of German infantry lay dead or wounded. The survivors retreated, leaving the road littered with debris. The Soviets had no strength to chase them, but they didn't need to. The damage was done. Oklopkov crawled back through the smoke. His uniform was torn, his left arm bleeding from shrapnel, but he was alive. Later that night, Red Army officers reviewed the situation reports. They could hardly believe it. The 7th Panzer Division's advance had been delayed by nearly 6 hours. That single disruption allowed reinforcements to reach Smolensk just in time to set up defensive lines. When his comrades found Oklopkov at dawn, sitting quietly near a burned-out truck, they asked what happened. He simply said, "I just aimed for the one who looked in charge." There was no celebration, no speech, just silent nods and the sound of distant artillery. Weeks later, intelligence confirmed the story. It wasn't propaganda, it was fact. That unbelievable shot had bought time when time meant survival. Smolensk held for weeks, becoming the first major point where the Red Army stopped the seemingly unstoppable Wehrmacht. Oklopkov would go on to fight for years, earning recognition as one of the Soviet Union's deadliest snipers. But he never forgot that day. Years later, he told a journalist, "That wasn't bravery, it was instinct. I didn't want to die, and I didn't want them to pass." Military historians later concluded that this was one of many small, localized acts that together broke the rhythm of Operation Barbarossa. A single rifleman, delaying a column for half a day, could shift the entire pace of an invasion. A war isn't won by miracles, but sometimes it's saved by one bullet at the right moment. By mid-July 1941, the German advance seemed unstoppable. The Wehrmacht had pushed hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory. Minsk had already fallen. Every day, thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured. Entire divisions disappeared. On the maps in Berlin, the road to Moscow looked wide open. But reality was different from what the maps showed. The closer the Germans moved towards Smolensk, the tougher the resistance became. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, had begun to recover from the initial shock of the invasion. They threw together new divisions overnight, filled with farmers, factory workers, and students. Many of them had never fired a rifle before, but they were sent to the front anyway. The only order was clear: stop the Germans, At any cost. Smolensk was more than a name on a map. It was the gateway to Moscow. Whoever controlled it controlled the highways and railways. That led directly to the Soviet capital. Hitler's generals expected it to fall within a week. It didn't. The Germans launched their assault on July 10, 1941. The same day, Fyodor Oklopkov fired his shot in the countryside nearby. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, had been tasked with taking the city. His forces included the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups, elite units that had crushed France just a year earlier. Their plan was simple: surround Smolensk from both the north and the south, trap the Soviet defenders, and annihilate them. At first it went according to plan. German tanks crossed rivers and fields, pushing forward relentlessly. Soviet defenses broke under the pressure. But something had changed. For the first time since the invasion began, the Red Army started to fight in a coordinated way. They began using ambushes, artillery traps, and local counterattacks. Commanders were learning. In the countryside, partisans and civilians joined the fight. Villagers dug trenches and built barricades. Trucks were loaded with sandbags, roads blocked with logs, and bridges rigged with explosives. Every mile the Germans gained came with a cost. Inside Smolensk, the situation was chaotic. The city's population had not been fully evacuated. Women, children, and the elderly worked alongside soldiers, filling sandbags, carrying ammunition. German air raids bombed the city daily, destroying power lines, hospitals, and water stations. Fires burned for days. Still, the red flag flew over the city hall. By July 15, German panzers had reached the outskirts and began surrounding the city. The temperature was above 35 degrees Celsius. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the smell of oil and blood. Soviet soldiers fought from basements, rooftops, and ruined buildings. They had little ammunition, no reinforcements, and no way out. But they refused to abandon their posts. German reports described fanatical resistance. Small Soviet groups continued fighting even when completely encircled. One platoon, led by Captain Sergei Kabanov, held a small hill overlooking the Dnieper River. For 4 days, they fought without food, using captured German weapons when their own failed. When the Germans finally took the hill, they found the bodies of 38 Soviets and more than 200 German soldiers dead around them. Such scenes repeated everywhere. Soviet engineers blew up bridges and railways, cutting German supply routes. A single demolition team destroyed a fuel convoy one night, creating an explosion so large it burned for hours and forced an entire German column to stop. Hitler received daily reports from the front. He was furious. He wanted quick victories, not drawn-out battles. His generals asked to pause for resupply, but he refused. He demanded that Smolensk fall immediately, calling it the key to Moscow. By late July, the Germans launched another all-out offensive. They used massive artillery bombardments and airstrikes. Entire city blocks disappeared, yet the Soviets continued to fight. At one major intersection, a machine gunner named Yelena Karpova, one of the few women in the defense force, held her position for 2 days. Her gun overheated twice, and she continued firing with a captured German MG-34. When her position was finally overrun, she was out of ammunition, but her stand delayed the German advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Across the front, Soviet units began to regroup. Generals Timoshenko and Zhukov coordinated new counterattacks from the east. On July 20th, the Red Army launched its first organized counteroffensive of the war. The assault was poorly coordinated. Communications failed constantly, and many units attacked without clear orders. But the effect was significant. German field reports recorded their confusion. Soviet troops attacked from all sides, unorganized but relentless. Some units ran out of bullets and charged with bayonets. Others brought in T-34 tanks, their first major appearance in the war. German shells bounced off their sloped armor, shocking tank crews who had never seen such machines. For the first time, the German army was forced to fight on the defensive. They managed to hold their lines, but it came at a cost. Entire divisions had to be diverted from the main advance to protect their flanks. The push toward Moscow slowed even more. By early August, Hitler announced that Smolensk was secured. In reality, the front had stalled. The Germans controlled the city center, but Soviet troops still held positions east of the Dnieper River and continued fighting in the forests. Thousands of encircled Red Army soldiers refused to surrender. The Battle of Smolensk lasted more than 2 months. Both sides were devastated. The Germans claimed victory, but it was a costly one. Over 250,000 casualties, hundreds of tanks destroyed, and, most importantly, precious time lost. The Soviets suffered even more, around 750,000 casualties. But they had achieved something no one thought possible. They had slowed the German advance. During those weeks, the Red Army gained time to move factories east, train new divisions, and prepare the defenses of Moscow. Operation Barbarossa had been designed to crush the Soviet Union in 8 weeks. By August, it was already behind schedule, and the German troops were exhausted. In Berlin, Hitler's frustration turned to anger. His generals warned that their forces were overstretched and supply lines too long. He ignored them again. He believed that one final push could end the war. That push would become Operation Typhoon, the assault on Moscow. But Smolensk had already changed everything. The momentum of the Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, had been broken. German tanks were worn out, their engines failing. Soldiers were tired and hungry, and the autumn rains were beginning. When winter came, the German army would find itself stuck in mud and ice, facing an enemy that refused to collapse. The delay at Smolensk meant that Hitler's army would reach the gates of Moscow just as the first snow began to fall. Smolensk was not a glorious Soviet victory. The city was destroyed, and hundreds of thousands died. But strategically, it was a turning point. It was where the Germans stopped advancing at full speed for the first time. It was where the myth of the invincible blitzkrieg began to crumble. Historians now view the Battle of Smolensk as the moment when Operation Barbarossa started to fail. The Germans still had strength, but they had lost the one advantage they needed most: time. And it all began with small acts that no one noticed at first. A blown bridge, a delayed convoy, a group of soldiers refusing to retreat. Among them was Fyodor Oklopkov, whose single shot on July 10th delayed a column of tanks for hours and bought precious time for the defense. In a war fought by millions, one man's action rarely changes the outcome. But sometime, a single moment, one trigger pulled at the right second, becomes part of a chain that shifts history itself. The Germans thought Smolensk was just another city. They were wrong. It became the place where their lightning war first lost its light. By mid-August 1941, the German army had pushed hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. But something had changed. The speed that once defined the blitzkrieg began to fade. Delays were piling up. Broken supply lines, exhausted fuel reserves, and unexpected Soviet resistance. One of the key choke points remained Smolensk. What the Germans thought would fall in a few days had held for over a month. That delay wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. For the first time, the Wehrmacht saw an enemy that refused to collapse. Reports from the front described chaos among the German logistics. Roads clogged with vehicles, horses collapsing under heavy loads, units running low on ammunition. Commanders complained that supply columns were under constant attack, not just by organized Soviet troops, but by scattered riflemen and partisans who appeared from the forests, struck, and vanished. In Berlin, the German High Command began to argue. Hitler wanted to split Army Group Center, send part of it north to help take Leningrad, and the rest south toward Kiev. His generals warned that doing so would waste the momentum. Moscow was the real objective, not the flanks. But Hitler was convinced the Red Army was already finished. While the Nazi leadership debated strategy, on the front line, soldiers like Fyodor Oklopkov kept fighting village by village. The Red Army's plan was simple: delay at all costs. Every hour mattered. Oklopkov's regiment, now reinforced, had been pushed east of Smolensk. They dug in along the Dnieper River, setting up crude defenses with whatever equipment remained. Food was scarce, ammunition rationed. Yet morale was higher than before. They had proven something. The Germans could bleed. In early September, a heavy fog covered the region. German scouts crossed the river at dawn, probing for weaknesses. Oklopkov, now a sniper, was stationed near a destroyed bridge. Through his scope, he saw the same familiar sight. Tanks rolling in, soldiers advancing behind. But this time the Soviets were ready. The command had reorganized artillery based on lessons from Smolensk. Instead of direct confrontation, they waited until the Germans were deep into the crossing. Then coordinated fire erupted. Mortars struck the first tanks. Machine guns tore through the infantry. And from the tree line, Oklopkov's rifle cracked again and again. Each shot aimed for an officer, a radio operator, or a machine gunner. For hours, the Germans tried to push through. Bridges collapsed, vehicles burned, and smoke covered the sky. When reinforcements arrived, they found the riverbank littered with destroyed equipment and bodies. It was not a decisive victory. The Soviets still lost ground. But they had inflicted enough damage to force the Germans to halt again. The pattern was repeating: advance, delay, regroup, advance again. By late September, Hitler's forces shifted focus southward toward Kiev. The city eventually fell, but it took time, precious time. When the Germans finally turned back toward Moscow in October, winter was already closing in. That delay, weeks, maybe a month, proved fatal. Snow and freezing rain turned the roads to mud. Vehicles broke down. Men froze in their sleep. The same army that had crushed Europe now struggled to move a few kilometers a day. Historians often point to logistics, overextension, and weather to explain the failure of Operation Barbarossa. But on the ground, it was often the result of countless small moments, like Oklopkov's shot near Smolensk, that compounded into something greater. One rifleman delaying one column meant fewer tanks at the next battle. One destroyed bridge meant another supply truck never reached the front. And one soldier's decision to stand instead of run could shift the balance of an entire campaign. In the winter that followed, the German army faced its first real defeat near Moscow. The Red Army launched a counteroffensive that pushed the invaders back dozens of miles. The myth of the invincible Wehrmacht was shattered. Oklopkov survived that winter. He fought on the Moscow front, later at Stalingrad, and throughout the rest of the war. By 1945, he had become one of the Soviet Union's most decorated snipers, credited with more than 400 confirmed kills. But he rarely spoke about the war. When asked about his unbelievable shot, he would shrug. "That day was just one day," he once said. "There were thousands like it." Decades later, Soviet archives confirmed what historians had long suspected. The 6-hour delay near Smolensk had changed the operational timeline of Army Group Center. Reinforcements that reached Moscow in October did so only because of that pause. In war, the big stories are written by generals, but the moments that matter most are decided by ordinary soldiers. Fyodor Oklopkov was one of them. He never sought fame, never posed for propaganda photos. After the war, he returned to Siberia, to the forest where he'd learned to shoot. He lived quietly until his death in 2001. In his village, the local Veterans Hall still keeps an old rifle under glass, marked with a simple plaque, "Used at Smolensk, 1941. For decades, his name was barely known outside Russia. Yet his story, one man, one rifle, one shot, endures as a reminder that even in the largest war in human history, the smallest acts can change everything. Because history isn't always written by those who planned it. Sometimes it's written by those who simply refuse to give way. As the smoke cleared over Smolensk, the world changed course. A single bullet had delayed an empire. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because while soldiers like Fyodor Oklopkov were fighting with rifles on the front lines, another war was being fought in the shadows. A war of deception, a war of lies, behind the front, inside cafes, embassies, and coded telegrams, a network of spies began shaping the battlefield in ways no bullet ever could. Their mission wasn't to kill, it was to make Hitler believe a lie. And for months, it worked. If you followed this far, subscribe and stay with me. Because in the next episode, we'll uncover how one spy's fake reports misled the entire German high command and changed the course of the Eastern Front before a single shot was fired.